Hey everyone, this is Paul Gale from paulgalenetwork.com, and thank you for joining me today for a dual episode of sorts of both video game news and video game talk. It is March 24th, 2021, and this is the top story of the day, as well as my discussion when it comes to video game talk. So, a couple of days ago, Takashi Mochizuki and Ian King over on Bloomberg.com had the following article: Nintendo to use new NVIDIA graphics chip in 2021 Switch upgrade. I will go over the article itself, but if you want to go and read the full thing, visit Bloomberg.com and read more for yourself. But basically, this is a story that we've been following for quite a long time. We've heard numerous reports, lots of rumors from lots of different sources over the last couple of years that Nintendo was going to be developing some type of Nintendo Switch upgrade device. Not quite a Nintendo Switch 2, but something coming. People thought, could it be 2019, 2020, 2021? Well, it looks like 2021 is the date, is the year. And going off of this, which Bloomberg is a reputable source, it just paints the picture that this thing is probably happening, that it's far more likely to be real than not. I will go over some of what this entails, and then I will break down what my thoughts are and what my hopes are of this potential Nintendo Switch Plus. First of all, it's said that this new Switch iteration will support NVIDIA's Deep Learning Supersampling, or DLSS. This is a novel rendering technology that uses artificial intelligence to deliver higher fidelity graphics more efficiently. There are different videos that you could look at online that show, computer settings at relatively low power, but using DLSS and being able to have comparable to 4K quality imaging, yet only taxing the system at 720p resolutions, and going even lower to, 1080p resolutions, but being produced on a 640p image or something of the like. Basically, it's not just all about resolution, but DLSS does certainly help in that department, helps paint over and retexturize a world. This would allow developers, if they wish to patch their old games on the Nintendo Switch Plus, make them look better, run at smoother levels than the original models could handle, both Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite. Just to pick one game in particular, Mortal Kombat 11. It's a very different model looking game on Nintendo Switch versus its Xbox One and PlayStation 4 counterparts. Unlike Dragon Ball FighterZ, which pretty much has equal parity across versions, you could tell the difference instantly when you're playing Mortal Kombat 11 on Nintendo Switch. It looks good, just a very different level of visual fidelity. It's lower. Could NetherRealm Studios potentially have a patch if this Nintendo Switch Plus is as powerful as we think it's going to be, and bring the Nintendo Switch Plus version to looking more like the Xbox One and PS4 versions? Entirely possible. It depends on what developers have access to, if they want to do it, what Nintendo is going to allow to be done, if there's enough power to do these things, and if this is indeed really happening. Now, I fully think it is. I've thought for a couple of years that something like this was going to happen. I didn't know when, I didn't know what power levels, but according to this report, this would be an OLED display upgrade. The original Nintendo Switch model has an LED display. It's nice, it's crisp, it's 6.2 inches, 720p. This would use a rigid OLED tech, so not quite the OLED screens on the highest quality of phones, but through a partnership with another company, having still OLED screens would mean a more clear, sharper image, perhaps even help with battery life consumption on the system. Maybe the battery would be reminiscent of the new Redbox Nintendo Switch. Hard to say, but with the dock, we would be getting 4K quality imaging. So on TV right there, going from 1080p regular Nintendo Switch to 4K is quite a significant upgrade. That brings the Nintendo Switch, at least from a resolution perspective, up to what, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 4 Pro, Xbox One X, and PlayStation 5 could do. Those four platforms, that ecosystem of last gen and current gen Xbox and PlayStation systems. This report also indicates that 720p would still be the resolution for handheld mode, but you'd be now playing on a 7-inch screen. So 720p resolution, same resolution as the previous Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite, but you'd be going up from that 6.2-inch screen on the base Switch to a 7-inch screen. So increasing the amount of square inches quite considerably, going OLED, being sharper, more clear, and having more power inside. NVIDIA, of course, and Nintendo representatives have declined to comment, and in the last 2 days, there have been no other comments on this. Reports also seem to indicate that this system could be $350, upwards of $400. Now, it would entirely be worth it, in my opinion, if this thing really did have the following: new and improved Joy-Con, DLSS technology, an OLED screen, the increase to 7-inch screen, and as also reported, more teraflops, more overall RAM, and a faster, more efficient CPU and GPU with more RAM inside and potentially even a greater storage solution than the base 32 gigabytes that every Nintendo Switch currently has. Now, I wouldn't expect it to be, gigantic, but perhaps something in the world of 128 gigabytes, especially since games are getting bigger and bigger. I think if you had 128 gigs inside of every Nintendo Switch Plus as the base, still being able to use, of course, micro SD XC technology, then that would be a pretty solid solution. A lot of people have already purchased micro SD XC cards in the last 4+ years of having a Nintendo Switch, so I could see that still being a viable medium for storage solution to expand. DLSS would be huge. That right there is probably the biggest factor of this system, if it is true. That's about it for the article. Like I said, you could read the rest of it if you wish. But I wanted to talk about that for starters because I think it's intriguing. Nothing new has really come in the last couple of days since this article was originally published. So what my hopes right now are is discussing something on the different side, something that I thought would be a have your cake and eat it too scenario that Nintendo could potentially have if the Nintendo Switch Plus is real. How do you maximize a new hardware and not alienate your 83 million plus install base, right? By the time this thing comes out, which potentially would be this November, right? Possibly launching alongside The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's successor, as we're getting reports that suggest new games that take advantage to really show and shine of what this new hardware could do will be launching simultaneously, not necessarily exclusive, but here's the flagship title that really takes advantage of the new technology, Breath of the Wild 2 on Nintendo Switch Plus, and it looks like this on this system. And it still runs very competent, very well on the Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch Lite, but wow, the difference is night and day. That gets people motivated to either upgrade, if they have a Nintendo Switch, to a Nintendo Switch Plus because they want to play Breath of the Wild 2 in its highest form of fidelity, most amount of texture work, highest frame rate, highest resolution, etc. And people that were sitting on the fence maybe don't have a system at all this generation, or bought another platform like a PS5 or an Xbox Series S or X, but see a Nintendo Switch Plus as, that could be my second system because now it's at a higher level of graphical fidelity compared to these new Sony and Microsoft machines than what the base Nintendo Switch was. After all, it's 4 years old. Now's the time to buy it, right? A lot of people are also buying multiple Nintendo Switch consoles per household. I could see that this Nintendo Switch Plus being the primary video game player in the household's new machine, and the base Nintendo Switch that they were previously using goes to the son, goes to the daughter, goes to the younger brother or sister or husband or wife that's not as hardcore of a gamer as the sole person, you know? Something like that would work in my household in particular. All four of us, my wife, my son, and daughter, my son is 6, my daughter's 4, we all play video games. We all have our gaming systems hooked up into the living room. I am the longest, most hardcore, if you will, video gamer in the household. The Nintendo Switch is mine, but everyone plays it. And, you know, if we were to adopt the Nintendo Switch Plus, which I definitely would be there day one, and that becomes the new main TV room system, the other Nintendo Switch with its dock goes to another TV, and that one gets to be played more often by someone else, whereas the Nintendo Switch Plus takes center stage. I'm playing it for all of my future games to play them in their highest capacity, and of course someone else is able to play it as well. But there goes one household having one system to two. I know plenty of families that already have 2 or 3 that would probably go to a third or fourth. So back to my topic though, because it was very easy to get off topic kind of, is how could Nintendo maximize this? Obviously, if this thing is significantly more powerful, it's probably going to have the capability of playing games that the normal Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch Lite could not. As we saw, Nintendo and third parties were able to do wonderful things with the platform that probably people didn't think was originally possible. Things like The Witcher 3 and Skyrim, playable on your base Nintendo Switch systems. Folks didn't think that that would probably be a thing in 2016, that a 2017 hybrid machine would be able to play these games and that well. Yet here we've got Doom and Wolfenstein 2 and Doom Eternal. Plenty of games that are coming out, you know, day and date or a few months later on Xbox One and PS4, also on Nintendo Switch, this little system this big, capable of doing those things, right? But Nintendo Switch Plus, if it really has a better and faster CPU, GPU, more T-flops, more RAM, etc., it will very likely be able to play games that the normal Nintendo Switch can't play. Something like Final Fantasy 15, something like Kingdom Hearts 3, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil Village perhaps. But you don't want to alienate the fan base of 83 million Nintendo Switch owners. And by the time this thing comes out, potentially you're looking at 90 million plus. So how do you do that? It's one thing if you release a Nintendo Switch 2. It's understood that it's a brand new console, brand new games come out for it. Yeah, it's backwards compatible, but you know, it's understood that Nintendo Switch owners, sorry, you can't buy a Nintendo Switch 2 game and play it on your Nintendo Switch. But if you buy a Nintendo Switch 2, you could play your old games, right? I don't think that that's what this system is going to be. Eventually, Nintendo will have a Nintendo Switch 2, and guess what? You won't be able to play Nintendo Switch 2 games on your Nintendo Switch. That's just what happens, you know? But the timing has to be right. You cannot short a system's life. You can't have a premature, you know, stoppage to a system that is so strong and so healthy and alienate and, you know, quite frankly, upset, betray a lot of fans by all of a sudden this system that's still healthy, still got a good ecosystem, 4,500 plus games, new games on the horizon, people that just bought one over the holidays, 2020, now, what? So I can't play Breath of the Wild 2 on this thing? That's unfortunate. And a lot more choice words than just saying unfortunate. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see Nintendo releasing any of their first party games in the next few years only on Nintendo Switch Plus. I see them releasing very scalable, very competent versions. Stuff like Bayonetta 3, Metroid Prime 4, the successor to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the new Pokemon game, and, you know, future titles that we aren't even fully aware of. They run fine. They run at their levels of 900p 30 frames per second, or in portable mode 640 30, or sometimes you get a 1080p 60 frames per second game with these type of graphics that you've come to expect on Nintendo Switch, which quite honestly still are great. You look at something like Starlink, you look at something like Astral Chain, very pretty games on the system. The system still has life left in it, but as the new platforms have come out, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, the difference is starting to become greater. Nintendo doesn't want to get lost in the talk, right? They still want to be the talk of the town. They still need to be relevant, culturally relevant. They have the only system quite like it, the only hybrid platform on the market. But eventually it's not going to be enough, because eventually, as these other systems are getting games that just can't run on Nintendo Switch anymore, Nintendo doesn't want to be left in the dust. So I see a very potential outcome being one of two things. One, third parties have to release all of their games on Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Switch Plus. They could be scalable, they could be functional to lower parity of graphical performance, but still have to work on the base model and run just fine, more optimized on Nintendo Switch Plus. Or, if that's not possible, they can't release it at all. But that seems like a shame, What if Injustice 3 could run on Nintendo Switch Plus, giving NetherRealm Studios a brand new platform with a new healthy ecosystem to play it on? But since NetherRealm can't get a working version of Injustice 3 on Nintendo Switch with this massive 90 million install base, because no matter how hard they try, it's just not worth the effort to build a brand new game from scratch. And they can't scale it down because they're working with Xbox Series X and S and PlayStation 5 and PC, and they just can't. It just doesn't make sense to make a completely different version for Nintendo Switch on the base models, right? Should they skip out on it at all altogether? We're not saying, oh, just release a broken version on Nintendo Switch. No, because that's not what anybody deserves, and that's not fair to pay. That's not reasonable to expect. If they can make, okay, a nice 1440p Injustice 3 on Nintendo Switch Plus, and a acceptable 720p 30 frames per second Nintendo Switch version of Injustice 3, and a 640p version 30 frames per second in portable mode of Injustice 3, fine. Release it, one cartridge, one eShop download code, and depending on what platform you play it on, it runs well. But if you can't do that, I don't think you should not release it at all. And this comes up to the main topic of today's video, and that is cloud versions. What if, instead of mandating that all third parties release their games to have to work on the single cartridge or the single digital eShop download code on all Nintendo platforms at once, what if on the box or in the eShop it says this title only runs on Nintendo Switch Plus. However, the developer, in this case I'm going with NetherRealm Studios, or I'm going with Square Enix with my Final Fantasy 15 example, they make a cloud version of that game available for playing on the Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite. This way you kind of get the best of both worlds. You don't alienate, you don't abandon this 83 or 90 million install base. You give them the opportunity that, hey, if Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch Lite is your only platform, you don't have a high-end gaming PC, you don't have a PS4 Pro or an Xbox One X, or an Xbox Series X or a PlayStation 5, all you have is a Nintendo Switch or a Nintendo Switch Lite, and you're not ready yet to buy a brand new Nintendo Switch Plus. You want to play Final Fantasy 15? Guess what? You can. You could buy it now as a cloud version on your Nintendo Switch. Now, this does mean you have to have a good, stable internet connection, but hey, at least it's not every game coming out in the next few years only being cloud version. It's not like, oh, Splatoon 3 all of a sudden is only a cloud version. No, Nintendo would still make sure that their games are scalable, that you buy one cartridge, it works on any platform. But certain third party games that otherwise would miss the console entirely would now at least be made available to you. And that would be the requirement. My pitch is, what if Nintendo requires all games that if they're going to have a Nintendo Switch Plus only version, that's fine, but make that game also available on the cloud for regular Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite owners. How does that sound to you? Because I like it. Of course, it does run into a couple of potential problems. Who's going to fund the cloud versions? How long will the cloud versions last? Will the cloud versions cost less? To break those answers down, one of my possible solutions was Nintendo would introduce Nintendo Switch Online Plus. Instead of $20 a year, it would be $30 a year, and the extra $10 would be required to have access to the cloud versions. Now you might say, okay, so how is that fair to consumers? You're making them pay $10 extra a year than the normal model just to have access to be able to get these cloud versions? Well, you'd give them or $30 a year if they're not willing to normally pay the initial 20. But hear me out. $30 a year gives you Nintendo Switch Online Plus access, gives you all of the deals that come with Nintendo Switch Online, right? The NES games, the SNES games, the cloud saves, the discount codes, Tetris 99, etc. But for that extra $10 a year, now you could buy cloud games. Nintendo works with another developer, someone that has the infrastructure to build such a cloud setup, and this is how you play it. As for the cost of the games, if you're buying a cloud version of a game, instead of $60 retail, it's $10 less. It's $50. So you could see right away that, upon buying 1, 2, 3 games a year that are cloud versions of them, you very quickly make your money back. You're paying less for the game. Yeah, you have less rights to the game because it's a cloud version. It might be less stable. You might be playing Injustice 3 on your Nintendo Switch base model, but hey, it's a cloud version. You only paid $50 for it. Yeah, you had to pay, 30 to initially get into that, but what you're getting in addition to, the ability to play cloud versions is still all of this other content, NES games, SNES games, cloud saves, etc. So the value definitely becomes worth it, even though some of the costs are, not to say hidden, but, diverted. And this way, it gives Nintendo funds to build this infrastructure to help third parties get their games on a cloud version. And then you have to think about the practicality. Is there an audience for it? If you look at a game like Final Fantasy 15, if Square Enix could release this title on the brand new Nintendo Switch Plus and have this beast of a game be made available on this surely strong selling dual purpose hybrid of a console that you could play on TV that has the recipe for success just like Nintendo Switch had, and now have your game selling equally as new people are buying Nintendo Switch Plus. Quite a few of them will be buying this Final Fantasy 15 portable version, but have this access to 90 million people. Even a very small percentage, even if 450,000 of these 90 million people would buy a cloud version of Final Fantasy 15 because it's their only system, they don't have a PS4, no Xbox One, no PC, not ready yet for a Nintendo Switch Plus, don't have an Xbox Series S, X, or PS5, then 450,000 copies, this is just a small number. I'm taking a very small percentage because you're thinking, this isn't for me. Maybe it is for you, but just because it's not for you doesn't mean that you don't represent doesn't mean that you represent everybody. There's a lot of different types of families, a lot of different types of gamers that buy Nintendo Switch. Not everyone has every machine, money to buy every new upgrade, etc. So you're looking at a very small percentage of people, but with the install base being so big, it only takes a small percentage to sell, almost half a million copies at $50 a pop, going to Square Enix on top of the amount of money that they would be making by selling a Final Fantasy 15 to, a decent amount of the new Nintendo Switch Plus user base. That sounds like a win-win recipe, right? It's better to have something than nothing available on the platform. I like this idea. I'm curious what you think. And the last thought that I had on this was, and this is a little bit, I don't want to say unreasonable, but this would be absolutely best case scenario, extremely pro consumer if Nintendo did something like this. Imagine if on your Nintendo Switch box of an upcoming game, I'm going to go right back and I'm going to call it Street Fighter 6 now. I was going to use Injustice 3, but I'm going to call it Street Fighter 6, okay? Street Fighter 6 comes out. It's available on Xbox Series X, S, PlayStation 5, and here's this red and white, Nintendo Switch box. It has a sticker on it and says, cartridge only works on Nintendo Switch Plus, but comes with a cloud version available on all Nintendo Switch models. It can't be as wordy, but it has to indicate that this is a Nintendo Switch Plus only game, but asterisk, comes with cloud version that's available on all. If you could make this case clear to the average consumer that hops into the GameStop, Best Buy, Walmart, Target, etc., then you're really looking at something pro-consumer, like I said. Someone who is a Nintendo Switch owner buys this copy of Street Fighter 6. They read on the box, this cartridge that I bought will not work on my Nintendo Switch, but it's future-proofing so that when I do have the money, when I do have the 350 or 400 bucks to buy a Nintendo Switch Plus, because I will eventually get there, this cartridge will work on that machine. But I'm not left without anything in the time being, because inside this box is a cloud access code for Street Fighter 6 to be run on my Nintendo Switch. Or perhaps it's just even simpler. That cartridge, yes, it works in your Nintendo Switch, but it's required to unlock the cloud version. That way you cannot, illegally sell or distribute the game. Share it with friends, right? So you wouldn't be playing off the cartridge itself, but the cartridge enables a cloud version to work. You see what I'm going with that? I think that's really a smart way. I'm a little bit biased because I came up with it, but I think it's a smart, very potential way that Nintendo could have the cake and eat it too, They don't have to disturb the ecosystem. They can make their existing user base happy. They could ensure them some future stability. It's kind of like, if you buy Spider-Man Miles Morales on PlayStation 4, but you're not ready for a PS5 yet, that's okay. You could play Spider-Man Miles Morales on your PS4 or PS4 Pro, and if it is that PS4 version of the game, that disc, when you are eventually ready to get a PlayStation 5, you take that disc and you put it on your PS5 and you're ready and you get to play the game in an enhanced way on your PS5, right? That would be brilliant if Nintendo would adopt that. Now, I said I don't know how likely it is to happen because it's so perfect, but the money behind it, the infrastructure behind it, it's not so simple. Do you convey to the people that you do have to have Nintendo Switch Online Plus, which requires you to have some type of, payment plan to play? Is that not fair? Is that anti-consumer? I think it's understandable because some money needs to be made to keep this infrastructure afloat. But at the same time, if you ever cancel the online infrastructure for a cloud game, you're not taking away someone's ownership of the game fully because they still have that cartridge. But after a few years, they may close down, Nintendo that is, they may close down the cloud-based functionality of the original Nintendo Switch, And now that cartridge you kind of have to upgrade to a Nintendo Switch Plus, or potentially down the line a Nintendo Switch 2. It sounds reasonable, right? You're never going to have a decision that any company makes that absolutely pleases every single fan. You're not. But when you're dealing with so many millions of people, there really are ways that you could make smart business moves that make sense financially and that also keep your loyal fan base happy because they're the ones that got you there. So you really have to have a healthy dynamic between, business model, what you give to the fans, appreciation of fans, so forth, back and forth. And then sometimes, a company needs to do something that's pioneering. And if anyone does that, it's Nintendo. Nintendo sometimes fall behind on a trend like, going HD or going with a hard drive, going with disc-based medium. But sometimes they're on the cutting edge, battery save in titles, analog stick, rumble technology, wireless technology, touchscreen tech, motion tech, hybrid tech. Like, they're very much on the cutting edge in some ways. And far more often than not, I feel that Nintendo are the pioneers of the video game industry. They keep pushing the envelope forward, and more often than not, people copy or emulate them than them doing that to others, right? So even when it comes to playing online, Nintendo gave us uh, quite some months of having Nintendo Switch Online just free access to playing games online. It took a while before they said, hey, now you got to pay $20 a year. So could Nintendo even do in the beginning, hey, we're going to cut some costs, we're going to eat it for a while, we're going to make cloud-based gaming free access to all of these games that are exclusive on Nintendo Switch Plus on an eShop or cartridge, but they will run technically via cloud on base models. We're going to make that free for a while, but then after a while, it's going to be understood that, hey, you have to pay $30 a year to run this, but you're also going to get Nintendo Switch Online functionality. Let me know what you thought. Like I said, this was kind of a dual video. It was part news, as I'm reporting something from Bloomberg, which is really exciting, and it's part a talk video because a lot of it was my own thoughts on what Nintendo could do to maximize fan base happiness and the true beauty of what this machine could do. I think it would be a shame, personally, if the Nintendo Switch Plus was so powerful that all it did was give us better looking versions of new games like Breath of the Wild 2, Metro Prime 4, Bayonetta 3, and other games on the horizon that we don't even know about, where they look this good on Nintendo Switch Plus and this good on Nintendo Switch. Not to say it would be a shame, but if it's this powerful, I want to see it being taken advantage of, and that's having some games that couldn't come out on it otherwise. If the machine does retroactively say, hey, here's a patch to Mortal Kombat 11, here's a patch to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate where it's a texture pack that just bumps everything up, increases the lighting, increases the visual fidelity, brings it up to 4K. It's already at 60 frames per second, but here's more texture work into the clothing. Here's a bumped up polygon models. Here's Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey cranked up to 1440p with new textures thrown in, Third party wants to jump in and say like, hey, we'll release a patch for Doom. We'll release a patch for, Wolfenstein 2 or Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Cool. There you go. You now get to play it higher. That actually sounds pretty sweet. Past games, stuff that already came out, getting to be played better frame rates. Some games going from 30 to 60. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 having, higher resolution in portable mode, better looking graphics, better loading. For some people, that just might be enough. And future games coming out like, wow, I'm glad that I have the Switch Plus instead of the normal Switch because Breath of the Wild 2 looks stellar on this new system and looks good on the old, but I'm glad I got the upgrade, right? I guess for some people, 350, 400 bucks, that's enough. DLSS, OLED, it's enough. New Joy-Con, maybe Joy-Con you could buy and determine what you want the left one to be. Do you want it to be a typical Joy-Con, a little bit tilted perhaps, but have the four buttons being split, or a Joy-Con with a D-pad? Swappable, interchangeable even? Eh, that's possible. That would be very cool. Um, but for some, that would be enough. For me, I would be happy with that. But like I said, if it's powerful enough to run games that the original Nintendo Switch cannot run, I want to see that. I want to see a platform in Nintendo Switch, including Nintendo Switch Plus, that's such a healthy ecosystem that has the most amount of games ever possible across a brand of platforms. You say, well, Nintendo didn't do it really with new Nintendo 3DS, right? They only had a few games, Minecraft, Xenoblade Chronicles, that ran exclusively on it. You had some games that ran improved, like Hyrule Warriors, Fire Emblem Warriors, right? You know, DSi had stuff that the DS didn't have, but not too much. The last time Nintendo did something like this, where the audience was split, was probably back in the Game Boy Color days. You had a big install base in Game Boy. You had Game Boy Color come out, and Game Boy Color actually had a fair amount of titles that could not be played on Game Boy. So it's potentially, there that Nintendo does this again. You could argue with the Nintendo 64 that with the 4 megabyte expansion pack, you had games that couldn't run without it. You're looking at Conker's Bad Fur Day or Donkey Kong 64. In some cases, it was Perfect Dark, where part of the game couldn't run. If you wanted the whole experience, you needed the expansion pack. So it's not unheard of that this idea of cloud-based gaming is a viable option. I want to know what you think. What you think of the rumors, what you think of my ideas, and as always, thank you for watching. This is Paul Gale Network signing out. I hope you all have a good one. Hope you enjoy the video. Look forward to talking to you in the comments below. Bye.